Recently, I've enjoyed 3 good sessions after the Roach on the Upper Stour. The conditions have been very good. There's been a tinge of colour, normal winter level, and we've had a long spell with very little rain really. And the Roach have been feeding. I've been catching them on bread with a bit of liquidised bread as feed. I've had some chub on one session, Roach to over £1, quite a few dace. I've tried different swims. Last weekend we had quite a bit of rain one day. By following the river gauges on the River Stour, the one at Hamoon's, the basic Upper Stour one, I could see that the river had come up about a foot, about 30 centimetres. That's not too bad. It means it would probably be a bit too coloured, and I needed for it to drop. So having waited 3 days, I went up to the Upper Stour and I found indeed it had dropped. It was still about 3 or 4 inches above what it had been the week before. But what alarmed me at first anyway is that the river was very coloured. It wasn't quite milky tea, but it certainly had a lot more colour. Visibility was down to sort of 3 or 4, 5 inches maybe, instead of more like 15 inches. And that colour meant that it might be more difficult to pick up fish. I'm on a different stretch to the one that I used in the last video, and I know there's plenty of fish there. There's roach there, dace, chub, gudgeon, perch and so on. But I'd really committed myself to fishing bread. I thought it was going to be a perfect river, and it wasn't. It had this colour. Didn't take any ground bait, just took liquidised bread, just took a few slices of bread for bait. Had no maggots, no worms, and I wonder, should I have taken some maggots? Would that have been a lot better? It's really hard to say. And this, my first impression seeing that river, like I say, was a sort of a look of horror. And I remember over 30 years ago turning up on the river with my mate Phil. We went there, we'd had no rain down in Wareham, and we didn't expect to find a river that was, it really was like milky tea, and yet it was only up about 2 inches. It was just very, very coloured. Obviously been some very heavy rain somewhere in that Upper Stour catchment. The fields had probably been ploughed. It was probably early December, very mild weather, and we got there. I don't know what bait we had. I would think we had maggots, probably not bread. And we just took a good hard look at it and thought, do we really want to fish this? This is horrible. And I think because we drove there separately, Phil went back home and I went off to fish one of the pits at Ringwood. Because I'd taken all my wagglers out of my box, I ended up fishing an avon float upside down like a ducker float, which looked a bit odd to anyone who saw me fishing that day, but it worked. I had some tench on the on this improvised ducker float. Anyway, back to this session. I started by fishing a slack. The wind was a bit awkward. The bank I was on, the east bank, was facing a moderate breeze, westerly breeze. There was a forecast for some drizzly rain to come in mid-afternoon, which is eventually what it did. But I started in a slack that was about 5 foot deep, and the first fish that I got was just a little one of an ounce or two, which at least I'd broken my duck. I caught something. What was a pleasant surprise is not too long after hooking a much better fish. I was quite convinced I'd hooked a chub. You can see me playing this fish here, and it felt more like a £1.5, £2 chub. It was trying to get into the snags on the bottom. I wasn't quite sure what was on the bottom close in this big slack. At one point I did hook up on something, not when I was playing the fish, when I was just testing the float. But I got it out. It was a really good roach, and just over £1. Nice solid fish, very good start to the day. Unfortunately, that was about it in that swim. I fished nearly an hour there, had one more small roach, dropped a couple, I think because I'd chosen a big heavy float taking 5 grams. My thinking was that although in this slack it needed a light float, I intended to fish some much deeper water a bit further downstream, and I thought a big heavy float might work better in that deep water. So having caught a couple of fish, I moved down to the next sort of likely swim in the conditions, on a sort of corner swim with a great big deep hole, back eddying slowly, around about 12 foot deep. I really hoped for some fish in this spot, but it wasn't to be. Didn't get any bites there at all. The current was constantly changing, and on the far bank you can see some willow trees with slack water under them, and I know for sure that there are fish under those willow trees. At one time you could fish between the trees there in floodwater conditions and catch fish, but that gap has sort of narrowed right up and can no longer access the far bank either. So after that unsuccessful stop off in that swim, moved on downstream to a bit of water where I've caught many roach over the years, and a few other decent fish as well. And it wasn't long before I began to pick up these small roach again, these 1 to 2 ounce fish. And after a little while I started to get odd little bites that I couldn't hit, and eventually I found out what they were. These other fish were little gudgeon, little tiny gudgeon, not very big. You can see one here. And this carried on for a while, and I was thinking, well, I'm pretty sure the liquidised bread is getting down to the fish. The current was quite steady, not as fast as I expected. And on my side of the river, the current was slacker than sort of 3/4 of the way across. It was the main current. So sure the bread was getting down, but I was still wishing that I'd got some gross guard on to feed. Nothing I could do about that. But eventually I found some better roach, and there's a couple on here to show you. This first one, not quite as big as the one I caught in the first swim, just under a pound. Very nice fish on a hard day. And a little bit later I got another one around about ½ a pound, and there was another one I swung in that was not quite as big, but all in all it turned out to be quite a reasonable session. In the event, that 5 gram float proved just about right, even though the current wasn't very strong. I used my usual Drennan Silvberfish Barbless size 16 hooks with a fairly small punch, around about 8 or 9 millimeters, and the float was just holding it back slowly, just trying to get the roach, tempt the roach, make sure it was slowed down enough for them to find it. It just shows that bread will work in conditions when you might think it wouldn't. You'd think coloured water and bread wouldn't go, but as long as it's not really thick and muddy, the fish will take bread. They obviously can find it, they can smell it. And like I say, I'm going to make sure I take some ground bait next time. There's more rain forecast over the next week or two. Whether that will mean a full-blooded flood, I don't know. You can never tell with the weather forecasts and what the river's going to do. We're certainly overdue a load of rain, but that doesn't mean we'll necessarily get it. So until next time, it's goodbye for now.